And now for another presentation, and this one is on unveiling modern slavery in Africa, insights from the Global Slavery Index. Our presenter is raring to go. Let's welcome Director of Operations Walk Free, Catherine Bryant.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge Professor John Azuma's personal story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it preempts one of the key messages of my presentation this morning, that is that modern slavery affects every single one of us. It is truly a global problem, and no country is immune to it. And therefore, as a result, we all have a role to play to tackle it. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so discussing our research at Walk Free, in particular, the findings of the Global Slavery Index at both the global level, but also in the Africa region. So I should just point out, the Global Freedom Network is the faith-based arm of Walk Free. Would we be able to get the slides up, please? Thank you. There we are. Sorry, bear with me. So Global Freedom Network is the faith-based arm of Walk Free, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Walk Free, we are an international human rights group that aims to eradicate all forms of modern slavery. We use evidence to drive advocacy, and the most well-known product that we produce is called the Global Slavery Index, which is the world's most comprehensive data set on modern slavery. The Global Slavery Index, or the GSI, underpins everything that we do at Walk Free. It informs our advocacy with governments in the international arena and our engagement with business, and of course, our engagement with faith leaders, which is why we are here today. So before I get into the report, would we be able to click onto the next slide, please? Thank you. Am I pointing the wrong way? It's guaranteed to be user error. I am such a Luddite when it comes to these things. Okay, I'll keep going. There we are. Fantastic. Thank you. So before I get into the report, I just want to touch on what we mean by modern slavery. So at Walk Free, we use the term modern slavery as an umbrella term that encompasses many different internationally defined concepts. This includes forced labor, forced marriage, human trafficking, slavery, and slavery-like practices, including debt bondage. At Walk Free, we focus on the commonalities between these different forms of exploitation. We believe there are situations where a person may not refuse or leave because of threats, coercion, deception, or violence. Definitions, however, can sometimes make us forget that we're actually talking about individuals that sit behind these internationally defined concepts. We're talking about individuals forced to work overseas for little or no pay, with no breaks, no days off, who may face violence or threats of punishment or deportation if they complain. It also includes a young girl married at 14 who is then forced into domestic servitude and unable to continue her education. So our data says that there are 50 million people of these individuals, 50 million of these individuals, 22 million in forced marriage and 28 million in forced labor. We produce something called the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, which is done in partnership with various UN agencies, including the International Labour Organization and the International Organization of Migration. We then at Walk Free take this data and break it down for 160 countries around the world, aiming to provide answers to three key questions. First of all, how big is the problem? Secondly, what makes people vulnerable? And thirdly, what are governments doing to respond? So what does this look like at the global level? And I'm very pleased this map has already had one appearance already today. So we can see that the top 10 countries in terms of highest prevalence, that is the highest number of people in modern slavery, are on the left-hand side of your screen. These individual countries are characterized by conflict, sometimes limited political will, and also impacted by the effects of climate change. This report, the Global Slavery Index, was last released in 2023, And for the first time, we were able to shine a light on the particular vulnerabilities of migrant workers, which is why we see the Gulf states appearing in the top 10 for the first time. We now know that adult migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be in forced labour than non-migrant workers. We also know that over the last 5 years, there has been a huge increase, approximately 10 million more people in modern slavery around the world. And this is largely as a result of the many compounding crises that we are facing. We saw in the last report in 2023 the lingering impacts of COVID-19. We also have seen the impact of conflict, which leads to increased vulnerability of individuals. We're also seeing more and more the impact of climate change. People fleeing natural disasters or the effects of slow onset climate change are fleeing and becoming more vulnerable to exploitation. We also know that environmentally degrading industries, such as deforestation, leads to an increase in exploitation. And finally, we were also looking at the supply chains of renewable energies. The mining of critical minerals and the production of solar panels through polysilicon are also highly vulnerable industries to exploitation. Within our report, we also look at the role of the impact of what governments are doing to respond, to try and understand better what is happening globally and who are the most active governments around the world. I will say, when looking at this screen, there may be some surprises, but the data is from 2022 and doesn't reflect some of the more recent changes we're seeing globally. We're also seeing, with countries such as the UK, Australia, Netherlands, Portugal, United States, that while there are very high rates of action, there are also some countries within that list who are starting to decrease the action on modern slavery. Globally, we're seeing a bit of a slide backwards in terms of the focus on this issue. Perhaps more interestingly, we also look at GDP in comparison to government responses. So when you correlate our assessment of government responses with GDP, you get a slightly different picture. So above the line, and apologies, it is quite small, you have pockets of progress, countries who have fewer resources at their disposal, who are actually taking relatively more action to tackle this issue. On the flip side, if you look below the line, you will see some countries that have relatively huge resources at their disposal who are taking limited action, and that includes countries in the Gulf states as well. Across the board, however, we're finding that current actions of governments is not enough to address the issue, and we need to move from intention to effective action, moving from developing laws to actually implementing those laws. We also, in our report, highlight the huge responsibility of the G20 in particular to tackle these forms of exploitation. Modern slavery affects every single country, so they have a responsibility to tackle exploitation within their borders, but they also import huge values of goods into their countries that are at risk of forced labour. We estimate almost $500 billion of goods are imported into G20 countries every single year, which are at risk of being produced with forced labour. So at the global level, and then I will move on to some of the findings from Africa, we have key recommendations that we ask of every single country. At the global level, at the international level, we want governments in the international community to recognise that modern slavery is embedded in other issues. So if we're going to be tackling the climate crisis, for example, we also need to be respecting human rights and tackling forced labour and forced marriage. We need to make sure that every single country has protection and prevention for the already vulnerable population, making sure social protections exist everywhere. Tackling forced and child marriage is a particular focus for Walk Free, making sure that there are criminal penalties associated with forced marriage, but also, as important, there are civil protections in place for those who are most vulnerable. We must also be looking at the role of business and making sure that we're tackling supply chain transparency, making sure we have mandatory human rights due diligence in place in order to make sure that businesses are investigating their own operations as well as their supply chains. And then finally, we would like to see governments and businesses prioritising human rights when engaging with repressive regimes. I just want to finish my presentation with a quick look at the regions. So we've mentioned the 50 million figure at the global level. This is then broken down into the different regions. Some of the regions that have the highest prevalence, that is the highest proportion of their population in modern slavery, include the Arab states, which is the highest prevalence across the board. This is followed by Europe and Central Asia, Africa and the Americas, and this again highlights the particular vulnerabilities of migrant workers. What does this then all look like in Africa? We see across the continent there are 7 million people living in modern slavery, and that's about 14% of the global total. This is broken down into about 54% in forced labor and 46% in forced marriage. We've heard already about some of the trends of exploitation across the continent, but as with many other places around the world, we see forced and early marriage as a result of social norms, but also the impact of COVID-19 and conflict. Across Africa, we see adults in forced labor in the mining, agriculture, fishing, and domestic work sectors. We can also see individuals increasingly migrate overseas who then are misled by traffickers with false promises and subjected to forced labor abroad. Children are also exploited in the pursuit of education across the continent. We have seen lots of progress as well. There's stronger government responses in Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Ghana, of course. We've seen more recent ratifications of relevant ILO and UN protocols, as well as strengthening of national referral mechanisms and establishing national action plans, including national action plans on business and human rights, which Ghana launched earlier this year. And my final point is, as with all countries in the world, there is still much more to be done. I'll leave you with our specific recommendations. I won't read through all of them, but similar to our global recommendations, we need to ensure that there is enough support for all survivors of exploitation. We need to raise the age of marriage for all to 18, and we need to make sure social protection exists to protect the most vulnerable and prevent exploitation. Without taking sustained action and maintained focus on this issue, we will see an increased and continued increase in the number of people experiencing all forms of modern slavery. We all have a role to play to tackle this most grievous human rights abuse, from governments enacting and enforcing legislation to businesses tackling exploitation in their own operations and supply chains. Faith plays a particularly pertinent role, from conducting advocacy and helping to shift the social norms that perpetuate these forms of abuse. I look forward to continuing our conversation together today with our partners and colleagues on what more can be done to tackle this human rights abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that really insightful presentation, all those numbers, but most importantly, the stories behind the numbers.